She thought she was dealing with a quiet military wife who would roll over and comply. She had no idea she was about to challenge Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, a decorated combat engineer who'd spent 3 tours building and defending bases in Iraq and who knew exactly how to establish unshakable boundaries. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the cozy ranch house in Riverside, California, as Lisa Rodriguez put the finishing touches on her famous blueberry pancakes. The kitchen was her sanctuary. Granite countertops she'd personally selected, stainless steel appliances she'd researched for months, and family photos covering the refrigerator that told the story of her life with her husband David. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. And their twin 8-year-old daughters, Maya and Sofia. At 34, Lisa looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length dark hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and kind brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled. To her neighbors, she was simply David's wife, the quiet woman who volunteered at the school bake sales and kept an immaculate garden. What they didn't know was that Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez had spent the last 12 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, including 3 combat deployments where she'd built forward operating bases under enemy fire and coordinated logistics for entire battalions. Lisa had been home for 8 months now, transitioning to civilian life after her final deployment. The adjustment hadn't been easy. Going from commanding respect from battle-hardened soldiers to being overlooked at PTA meetings was jarring. But she'd found peace in creating a warm home for her family, especially after years of living in military housing and overseas bases. David worked as an EMT at the local hospital, pulling long shifts that often left Lisa managing the household alone. She didn't mind. Organization and logistics were her specialties. Every morning followed the same routine: coffee at 0600 hours, old habits died hard, breakfast prep at The twins would stumble downstairs to find perfectly prepared meals, ironed school clothes, and packed lunches with little notes from Mom. This Tuesday morning felt especially perfect. David was on a rare day off. The girls were sleeping in during spring break, and Lisa was enjoying the quiet satisfaction of a well-run household. The Rodriguez household ran like clockwork, and Lisa was the engine that kept it moving. She'd transformed their modest 3-bedroom house into a home that could have been featured in Better Homes and Gardens. Every room reflected careful planning, the living room with its comfortable sectional positioned for optimal family time. The girls' bedroom with custom-built bunk beds Lisa had constructed herself using carpentry skills learned during base construction projects, and her pride and joy, the kitchen. Lisa had personally renovated the kitchen over 6 months, doing most of the work herself. She'd torn out walls to create an open concept, installed new cabinets with military precision, and created a space that served as both the family's gathering place and her personal command center. The kitchen island doubled as homework station and craft table, while the breakfast nook held a built-in bench with hidden storage she'd designed for the girls' art supplies and games. David often joked that his wife could have been an interior designer instead of a soldier, but Lisa knew better. Every choice in their home served a purpose: sightlines for monitoring the kids, efficient traffic flow, and storage solutions that would make a quartermaster weep with joy. As Lisa flipped pancakes, she thought about how far they'd come. This house represented everything she'd fought for overseas: a safe space for her family, a place where her daughters could grow up feeling secure, and tangible proof that her sacrifices during those long deployments had been worth it. The twins' laughter echoed from upstairs as they played in their room, and David was out back tending to the vegetable garden Lisa had taught him to plant. These quiet family moments were what had kept her going during those 3 a.m. mortar attacks in Fallujah, when she'd been responsible for keeping an entire base's infrastructure running while dodging sniper fire. Every family photo on the refrigerator told a story: David's graduation from EMT school while she was deployed in Iraq, the twins' first day of kindergarten that she'd missed due to a mission in Afghanistan, birthday parties, celebrated via video call from thousands of miles away. This house, this kitchen, this life, it was what she'd earned through years of service and sacrifice. Lisa checked her watch. 800 hours. David's mother, Margaret, was supposed to arrive at 1000 for a week-long visit. Lisa had spent the previous day deep cleaning the guest room and stocking the refrigerator with Margaret's favorite foods, determined to make the visit pleasant despite their complicated history. As Lisa arranged the pancakes on serving plates with the same precision she'd once used to organize supply convoys, her military training showed in subtle ways. She automatically positioned herself where she could see both the front door and the backyard through the kitchen windows, old habits from years of maintaining situational awareness in hostile territory. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each task flowing seamlessly into the next, with the efficiency of someone trained to operate under pressure. The twins bounded downstairs, and Lisa's demeanor shifted instantly to warm mother mode. "Buenos dias, mis amores," she said, switching to the Spanish she'd grown up speaking with her own grandmother. Maya and Sofia climbed onto the island stools, chattering about their plans for the day while Lisa served their breakfast with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to coordinating meal distribution for two. David appeared through the back door, soil on his hands and a smile on his face. "Smells amazing in here," he said, kissing Lisa's cheek. "Mom's going to love your cooking." Lisa smiled back, but something flickered in her eyes. A brief flash of the steel that had earned her respect from hardened combat veterans. Margaret Thompson had very specific opinions about how things should be done, and she'd never been shy about sharing them. But this was Lisa's house, her family, her domain. She'd defended bigger territories than this kitchen against more dangerous opponents than a critical mother-in-law. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted her thought. Through the window, Lisa could see a silver Mercedes sedan parking behind David's pickup truck. Margaret had arrived early and she was already surveying the property with the calculating gaze of someone taking inventory. Time to see what this visit would really bring. Margaret Thompson emerged from her Mercedes like a general surveying conquered territory. At 62, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd never been told no and didn't plan to start hearing it now. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair was sprayed into submission. Her designer pantsuit was wrinkle-free despite the 2-hour drive, and her sharp blue eyes were already cataloging everything that needed her immediate attention. David rushed out to greet his mother, his face lighting up with genuine affection. "Mom, you made good time. How was the drive?" Margaret allowed him a brief hug before stepping back to examine the front yard with the intensity of a health inspector. "The grass needs cutting, Dave, and that fence could use a fresh coat of paint." She hadn't even made it to the front door, and she was already issuing improvements. Lisa watched through the kitchen window as Margaret's gaze swept across their home's exterior. The older woman's expression suggested she was mentally tallying everything that fell short of her standards. Lisa had seen that look before, on the faces of visiting brass who arrived at forward operating bases, expecting to find fault with every detail of construction and maintenance. When Margaret finally entered the house, her heels clicked against the hardwood floors. Lisa had refinished herself. The twins ran to greet their grandmother, chattering excitedly about their spring break plans, but Margaret's attention was already elsewhere. She moved through the living room with purpose, straightening throw pillows that were already perfectly arranged, and adjusting picture frames that hung exactly where Lisa wanted them. "Lisa, dear," Margaret called out in a tone that dripped with false sweetness, "I can see you've been trying your best with the decorating." The word trying hung in the air like smoke from a grenade. David shot his wife an apologetic look, but Lisa just smiled and continued wiping down the already spotless counters. She dealt with more intimidating opponents than a passive-aggressive mother. Margaret finally made her way to the kitchen, and Lisa could see the exact moment when the older woman's demeanor shifted from critical to territorial. Margaret's eyes swept across the granite countertops, the professional-grade appliances, and the carefully organized cabinet. This wasn't just inspection anymore. This was evaluation for acquisition. "Well," Margaret announced, setting her oversized purse on the kitchen island with deliberate authority, "I can see this space has potential." She opened the refrigerator without asking, pulled out ingredients, and began moving them around as if she were rearranging chess pieces. "David, you know how much I love to cook for my family. It's been far too long since you've had a proper home-cooked meal." Lisa felt her jaw tighten slightly. She'd been cooking for David and the girls every single day since returning from deployment. The twins were happily eating her blueberry pancakes at that very moment, syrup dripping down their chins, as they giggled about something Maya had whispered to Sofia. But Margaret continued as if Lisa's cooking didn't exist. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I brought my special spice collection, Margaret said, producing a large container from her luggage. You'll need to clear out some of these cabinets to make room for proper ingredients. She began opening Lisa's carefully organized spice cabinet, frowning at the military-precise rows of alphabetically arranged containers. This system is all wrong. No wonder your food lacks flavor. David looked uncomfortable, caught between his wife and his mother. Mom, Lisa's actually a great cook. You should try her. But Margaret waved him off dismissively. Men don't understand these things, sweetheart. Lisa and I will sort out the kitchen properly. Lisa's hands stilled on the dish towel she'd been folding. In Iraq, when someone questioned her competence, she'd had the authority of rank and the respect of her position to back her up. Here, in her own kitchen, she was just David's wife being corrected by his mother. The familiar feeling of being underestimated settled over her like an old, uncomfortable uniform. Margaret continued her territorial expansion, moving Lisa's appliances to make room for her own coffee maker, relocating the twins' artwork to better spots, and generally rearranging everything within reach. I know you military wives do your best, she said with patronizing sympathy, but you simply don't have the time to learn proper homemaking skills. All that time away on deployment, it's such a shame what it does to a family. The words hit their mark. Lisa had missed birthdays, first steps, school plays, and countless bedtime stories because of her service. The guilt was something she carried every day, and Margaret had just weaponized it with surgical precision. David stepped closer to his wife, recognizing the warning signs in her posture, the slight straightening of her spine, the way her hands moved to her sides, the focused calm that preceded decisive action. But Lisa wasn't ready to engage yet. She was still gathering intelligence, assessing the threat level, and planning her response. Margaret Thompson might think she was dealing with a pushover military wife, but she was actually facing someone who'd coordinated the defense of entire installations against enemy attack. This kitchen was Lisa's territory, and she'd learned long ago that the best defense started with understanding your opponent's tactics. Margaret was just getting started, and Lisa was taking careful notes. By the second day of Margaret's visit, the invasion had expanded beyond the kitchen. Lisa woke up to find her coffee maker unplugged and replaced with Margaret's elaborate espresso machine, which took up half the counter space and required a manual thicker than most military field guides. The twins' breakfast routine had been completely disrupted, as Margaret insisted on preparing proper European-style meals that took twice as long, and left Maya and Sofia fidgeting impatiently at the table. "Grandmother Margaret," Sofia said politely, "we usually have cereal on school days, because Mom makes it fast and we have time to play before the bus comes." Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, sweetheart, that's exactly the problem. Your mother never learned that feeding a family properly takes time and effort. We're going to fix that while I'm here." Lisa bit her tongue as she watched her daughters reluctantly eat unfamiliar food while glancing longingly at their regular breakfast spot where their usual bowls sat unused. The twins had developed their morning routine over months of careful adjustment. After Lisa's return from deployment, stability and predictability were crucial for military children who'd experienced too many disruptions. But Margaret was bulldozing through their carefully constructed normalcy. The older woman had also taken it upon herself to reorganize Lisa's pantry, moving items to more logical locations that made no sense to anyone but her. Lisa's emergency food storage, a habit from years of ensuring her unit never went hungry, had been dismissed as hoarding behavior, and relocated to make room for Margaret's imported olive oils and artisanal vinegar. When Lisa tried to retrieve ingredients for the twins' lunches, she found herself searching through her own cabinets like a stranger in her own home. "You really should let David handle the finances," Margaret announced while examining Lisa's carefully organized coupon collection and meal planning binder. All this penny pinching isn't necessary anymore. He makes decent money at the hospital. The comment stung because Margaret didn't understand that Lisa's budgeting wasn't about necessity. It was about the military values of resourcefulness and preparation that had kept her soldiers fed on impossible budgets in impossible conditions. David tried to mediate when he returned from his shift, but Margaret had perfected the art of timing her most cutting remarks for when he was out of earshot. She questioned Lisa's cleaning methods, suggested the twins needed more structure and discipline, and somehow managed to imply that Lisa's career had been a selfish choice that had damaged the family. Every criticism was delivered with a smile and wrapped in concern, making it impossible for David to see the systematic dismantling of his wife's confidence and authority. The breaking point came on the third morning when Lisa discovered Margaret in the twins' room, pulling clothes from their carefully organized drawers. "These outfits are completely inappropriate," Margaret declared, holding up Maya's favorite unicorn t-shirt with obvious disdain. "Little girls should dress like little ladies, not like they're heading to summer camp every day." Lisa watched from the doorway as Margaret rejected outfit after outfit that the twins loved, replacing them with stiff dresses and uncomfortable shoes from shopping bags Lisa hadn't seen before. Maya's face fell as her beloved shirt was tossed into a donation pile without consultation. Sofia clutched her favorite dinosaur sweater protectively, tears threatening to spill over. "Miss Thompson," Lisa said quietly, her voice carrying the controlled authority she'd once used to address insubordinate soldiers. "Those are their favorite clothes." Margaret barely glanced up. "That's exactly the problem, dear. Children don't know what's appropriate for them. They need guidance from adults who understand proper presentation." Lisa felt something shift inside her chest, the same cold focus that had descended when her base came under attack, and she'd had to coordinate the defense while mortar rounds exploded around the perimeter. Her daughters were crying, her home had been invaded, and her competence as a mother was being systematically destroyed by someone who'd never spent a day away from her children, never missed a bedtime story due to enemy fire, never had to video call a sick child from a bunker because duty demanded she stay at her post. The twins looked between their mother and grandmother, confusion and distress written clearly on their young faces. Maya whispered, "Mama, can I keep my unicorn?" And Lisa saw her own childhood reflected in her daughter's eyes, the uncertainty of not understanding why adults were fighting, the fear that somehow it might be their fault. Margaret continued sorting through the clothes with the methodical efficiency of someone conducting a military inspection, completely oblivious to the emotional damage she was inflicting. "I've also scheduled appointments with a proper hairdresser," she announced. "These ponytails are far too casual for young ladies. They need proper styling." Lisa's hands moved to her sides, fingers automatically positioning themselves as if reaching for the sidearm she'd carried for over a decade. The muscle memory was still there, the readiness to defend what mattered most against any threat. Margaret Thompson might outrank her in family hierarchy, but this was Lisa's home, her children, her life that she'd built from the ground up after sacrificing everything for her country. The war for the Rodriguez household was about to begin, and Margaret had just made the fatal mistake of targeting the wrong soldier's children. Part 4, The Declaration of War. The fourth morning arrived with an ominous calm that any combat veteran would recognize. Lisa had spent the night lying awake, listening to Margaret rearrange furniture in the guest room, and strategizing her next moves like a general planning an offensive. The older woman had been testing boundaries for 3 days, and Lisa could sense that today would bring the final escalation. David had left for a double shift at the hospital, kissing Lisa goodbye with apologetic eyes that promised they'd talk when he returned. The twins were still asleep, exhausted from the emotional upheaval of having their routines constantly disrupted. The house felt like a battlefield during a temporary ceasefire, quiet, but charged with the promise of renewed conflict. Lisa entered her kitchen at precisely 0630 hours, as she had every morning for 8 months. But this time, she found Margaret already there, moving with the purposeful energy of someone executing a long-planned operation. The older woman had risen before dawn to set her trap, and now she stood in the center of Lisa's carefully designed space, like a conquering general, claiming new territory. "Good morning, Lisa," Margaret said without turning around. She was rearranging the cabinets again, this time removing Lisa's dishes entirely and replacing them with a set of expensive china that had appeared overnight. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I've decided it's time for some real changes around here." Lisa poured herself coffee from Margaret's espresso machine, noting how the woman had positioned herself to control access to the refrigerator, the stove, and the main workspace. It was a tactical positioning that would have impressed Lisa's former commanding officers. Margaret had effectively established a choke point that forced Lisa to ask permission to access her own kitchen resources. "I called David last night during his break," Margaret continued, pulling out a folder thick with printed pages. "We had a long discussion about the family's needs, and he agreed that things needed to be more organized around here." She spread the papers across the island, meal plans, shopping lists, and what appeared to be a complete household management system. "I'll be taking over the cooking and meal planning indefinitely. David thinks it's a wonderful idea." Lisa's coffee cup paused halfway to her lip. The tactical brilliance of the maneuver was undeniable. Margaret had gone around Lisa's authority by appealing directly to David while he was tired and stressed at work, probably catching him off guard when he couldn't properly process what he was agreeing to. It was the kind of flanking maneuver that would have earned respect in a war college classroom, if it weren't being used to destroy Lisa's family life. "I don't think David fully understood what he was agreeing to," Lisa said carefully, her voice maintaining the professional calm she'd used when delivering situation reports under fire. Margaret's smile sharpened like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "Oh, but he did, dear. He's finally realized that you military types simply don't have the domestic skills necessary to run a proper household. All that time playing soldier has left you completely unprepared for real women's work." The words hit Lisa like a sniper's bullet, precise, devastating, and designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Margaret had just dismissed 12 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, and the leadership of hundreds of soldiers as playing soldier. But worse than the personal insult was the implication that Lisa's sacrifice for her country had somehow made her less of a woman, less of a mother, less worthy of respect in her own home. Lisa set down her coffee cup with the controlled precision of someone handling live ammunition. "Mrs. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my kitchen, my home, and my family. I appreciate your help, but..." Margaret cut her off with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Your kitchen? Oh, sweetheart. That's where you're wrong." The older woman moved to the drawer where Lisa kept the important household documents, mortgage papers, insurance policies, the deed to their home. With theatrical precision, Margaret pulled out the deed and spread it on the counter like a battle map. "David's name is on this deed, not yours. You were deployed when they bought this house. Remember? Legally speaking, this is David's house, and as his mother, I have more claim to manage it properly than some part-time wife who's been gallivanting around foreign countries playing war games." Lisa felt the blood drain from her face. Margaret was technically correct. The house purchase had been finalized during Lisa's second deployment to Afghanistan, when power of attorney and David's signature were the only options available. It had never mattered before, because they were a team, a family, partners in building their life together. But now Margaret was weaponizing a legal technicality like a lawyer launching a court-martial. "So here's how this is going to work," Margaret announced, her voice dripping with false sweetness, as she gestured around the kitchen like a queen addressing her subjects. "This kitchen is mine now. I'll be doing all the cooking, meal planning, and food purchase. You can keep playing house in the other rooms, but this space belongs to someone who actually knows how to use it properly." The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa stood perfectly still, her mind processing the declaration with the same analytical clarity she'd used when calculating blast patterns and defensive position. Margaret had just claimed ownership of the heart of Lisa's home, dismissed her military service as irrelevant, and challenged her authority as a wife and mother. This wasn't criticism anymore. This was a declaration of war. Lisa's hands moved to her sides, muscle memory from a dozen combat deployments taking over as she assessed the threat level and began calculating her response. Margaret Thompson thought she was dealing with a powerless military wife who would surrender at the first sign of legal technicalities and family politics. She had no idea she had just challenged a decorated combat engineer who had spent years defending territory against enemies far more dangerous than an overreaching mother-in-law. The war for the Rodriguez household had officially begun, and Margaret had just made the fatal mistake of underestimating her opponent. Lisa Rodriguez stood in her kitchen, in Margaret's claimed territory, for exactly 30 seconds of complete silence. Those 30 seconds felt like the longest firefight of her military career, but her mind was working with the crystalline clarity that had made her one of the most effective combat engineers in her unit. Margaret had just made 3 critical tactical errors. She'd underestimated her opponent, she'd revealed her entire strategy too early, and she'd forgotten that successful military operations require more than just occupying territory. They require the ability to hold. "I see," Lisa said quietly, her voice carrying the same deadly calm she'd used when coordinating artillery strikes. "You've certainly thought this through." She moved around the kitchen island with fluid precision, noting how Margaret unconsciously stepped back as Lisa entered her personal space. Combat veterans learn to read body language like a survival skill, and Margaret's posture was screaming amateur, all bluster and no real backbone when faced with someone who refused to be intimidated. Margaret, sensing that her declaration hadn't produced the immediate surrender she'd expected, doubled down on her attack. "I'm glad you're finally being reasonable about this. I know it's hard for you military types to admit when you're out of your depth, but domestic life requires different skills than whatever you did overseas." She gestured dismissively toward the family photos on the refrigerator, including several of Lisa in full combat gear standing beside the bridges and fortifications she'd built under enemy fire. Lisa followed Margaret's gaze to those photos and felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, but the cold, focused determination that had carried her through 3 tours of duty. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Thompson. Domestic life does require different skill." She pulled out her phone with the casual confidence of someone accessing a weapon they knew how to use expertly. "For instance, it requires understanding legal documentation." Margaret's eyebrows raised in confusion, but Lisa was already scrolling through her contacts. "David," she said when her husband answered, putting the call on speaker before Margaret could object. "Hi, honey. I know you're busy, but your mother just showed me some interesting paperwork, and I wanted to clarify something with you real quick." David's tired voice filled the kitchen. "Hey babe, is everything okay? Mom said you two were working out some household stuff." Lisa's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, we're working things out all right. She just told me that since the house deed only has your name on it, she has more authority over our home than I do. I wanted to make sure you agreed with that assessment." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Margaret's face went pale as she realized Lisa had just executed a perfect flanking maneuver, forcing David to choose sides in real time with full knowledge of what was actually happening. "She said what?" David's voice carried a note of dangerous calm that Margaret had clearly never heard before. "Mom, what exactly did you tell my wife?" Margaret's composure cracked like armor under sustained fire. "David, sweetheart, I was just trying to help organize things while I'm here." Lisa misunderstood my intentions, but Lisa wasn't done with her counterattack. "Oh, I understood perfectly. You also mentioned that you'd spoken with David last night, and that he'd agreed you should take over all cooking and meal planning indefinitely. Is that accurate, honey?" Another pause. When David spoke again, his voice had the controlled fury of a medical professional who'd just discovered malpractice. "I never agreed to any such thing. We talked for maybe 2 minutes about dinner plans for today." "Mom, what the hell is going on over there?" Lisa watched Margaret's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally desperate calculation as she realized her carefully constructed manipulation was collapsing in real time. The older woman had built her entire strategy on David's absence and Lisa's presumed passivity, never considering that a combat veteran might have learned a thing or two about intelligence gathering and tactical communication. "Furthermore," Lisa continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used when briefing senior officers, "I pulled our mortgage and property documents this morning while you were setting up your command post in my kitchen." She held up her phone, showing a screen full of legal documents. "Interesting thing about military spousal rights and property law, Mrs. Thompson. Even though David's name is the only one on the original deed, California's community property laws and the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act establish my equal legal claim to this residence." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She'd played her strongest card, the legal technicality, only to discover that her opponent had an entire deck she'd never even considered. Lisa's years of dealing with military bureaucracy and legal documentation had given her skills that Margaret couldn't match. But more importantly, Lisa said, moving closer to Margaret with the predatory grace of someone who'd learned to advance under fire, I pulled our homeowner's insurance policy. Did you know that unauthorized modifications to kitchen appliances and structural arrangements can void coverage? Moving gas lines, electrical connections, and permanently installing authorized equipment without permits? She gestured toward Margaret's elaborate espresso machine setup. That's exactly the kind of liability issue that insurance companies love to use to deny claims. David's voice crackled through the speaker with barely contained fury. Mom, you need to stop whatever you're doing right now. Lisa, I'm coming home. We're settling this today. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at Lisa with the dawning realization that she'd just picked a fight with someone who'd spent years outmaneuvering enemies far more dangerous than an overreaching mother-in-law. Lisa pocketed her phone and smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who'd just executed a perfect tactical victory. Now then, Mrs. Thompson, shall we discuss the terms of your withdrawal from my kitchen? Margaret Thompson stood in the kitchen like a general who'd just watched her entire army defect to the enemy. Her perfectly coiffed hair was showing signs of stress, and her manicured hands trembled slightly as she processed the complete tactical annihilation she'd just experienced. Lisa watched with the detached professionalism of someone conducting a post-battle assessment, noting every sign of Margaret's psychological retreat. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding, Margaret began, her voice lacking the commanding authority she'd wielded just minutes earlier. I was only trying to help make things more organized while I'm visiting, but Lisa had learned in combat that once an enemy was in full retreat, you didn't give them time to regroup and mount a counter-offensive. Let me help you understand the situation more clearly, Lisa said, moving to her laptop and opening a folder she'd prepared that morning while Margaret was still asleep. Years of military briefings had taught her the power of visual evidence, and she'd spent the pre-dawn hours documenting every change Margaret had made to their home. These are time-stamped photos of my kitchen before your arrival, and these show the unauthorized modifications you've made. The screen displayed a side-by-side comparison that would have made any quartermaster proud. Lisa's original organization system, logical, efficient, and tailored to her family's needs, contrasted sharply with Margaret's chaotic rearrangements that prioritized aesthetics over functionality. Notice how your changes have blocked the twins' access to their breakfast supplies, eliminated the homework station where they do their daily studies, and created safety hazards by moving cleaning supplies to lower cabinets where children can reach them. Margaret's face grew paler with each image. She'd thought she was improving the space, but Lisa's documentation revealed the systematic destruction of a carefully designed family environment. I was just trying to make things more elegant, Margaret whispered, but even she could see how weak the excuse sounded. Elegant for whom? Lisa asked, advancing to the next set of photos. These show the twins' bedroom before and after your improvement. Maya crying over her donated clothes, Sofia hiding her favorite sweater to protect it from your purge. Tell me, Mrs. Thompson, how does traumatizing my daughter serve anyone's definition of elegant? The sound of tires on gravel announced David's arrival. He'd made the 20-minute drive from the hospital in what must have been record time, and when he burst through the front door, his EMT training was evident in how quickly he assessed the situation. Margaret was cornered, Lisa was in full command mode, and the kitchen looked like a war zone with papers, photos, and displaced belongings scattered across every surface. What the hell happened here? David demanded, his voice carrying the exhausted fury of someone who'd just abandoned his patients to rush home to a family crisis. Margaret turned toward her son with desperate hope, but David's expression stopped her cold. This wasn't the accommodating boy she'd raised. This was a man who'd just discovered his mother had declared war on his wife and children. David's sweetheart, Margaret began, but Lisa smoothly intercepted. Your mother claimed ownership of our kitchen, told me I was unfit to manage our household due to my military service, and informed me that she had more legal right to our home than I do. She also told our daughters that their favorite clothes were inappropriate and donated them without permission. David's face went through several color changes as he processed this information. She did what? He turned to Margaret with an expression that would have made his drill sergeants proud. Mom, I asked you to help Lisa feel welcome, not stage a hostile takeover of our family life. Margaret's last desperate gambit was to appeal to family loyalty. David, I'm your mother. I raised you, sacrificed for you, and I only want what's best for your family. Surely that counts for something, but Lisa had anticipated this move and was ready with her most devastating count. Speaking of sacrifice, Lisa said quietly, pulling out her phone to display her military service record. Let's talk about what that word actually means. The screen showed commendations, deployment records, and a photo of Lisa standing beside a bridge she'd built under enemy fire to ensure supply convoys could reach isolated outposts. 3 combat deployments. 15 months total away from my family. Missing Maya's first steps because I was building infrastructure to keep soldiers alive. Missing Sofia's first day of school because I was coordinating the defense of Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Margaret's appeal to sacrifice crumbled like a poorly constructed fortification. She'd never spent a day away from her son by choice, never missed a family dinner due to duty, never had to video call her children from a bunker while mortars exploded overhead. Her sacrifices were the normal challenges of parenthood. Lisa's sacrifices had been measured in time zones and enemy fire. David looked between his mother and his wife, and Lisa could see the exact moment when he fully understood what had been happening in his absence. Mom, he said with quiet finality, you need to pack your things and leave. Today, Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. David, you can't choose her over your own mother. But David's response came with the authority of someone who'd just realized his family had been under attack. I'm not choosing anyone over anyone else. I'm protecting my wife and children from someone who thinks she has the right to walk into our home and destroy everything we've built together. The surrender was complete. Margaret Thompson, who'd entered the Rodriguez home like a conquering general, was now faced with the humiliating reality of retreat under fire. Lisa watched with professional satisfaction as the woman who'd called her military service playing soldier learned what real strategic thinking looked like. Within 2 hours, Margaret's Mercedes was loaded with her belongings, her elaborate espresso machine, and the shattered remains of her authority. As she drove away, Lisa stood in her reclaimed kitchen, surveying the territory she'd successfully defended. The war was over, and there had never been any doubt about who would win. The silence that followed Margaret's departure was different from the tense quiet that had filled the Rodriguez house for the past 4 days. This was the peaceful silence of a secured perimeter, the calm that comes after successfully defending what matters most. Lisa stood in her kitchen, methodically returning each item to its proper place with the same precision she'd once used to restore order to damaged forward operating bases. David helped wordlessly, his movements careful and deliberate as he processed what had just happened. Every few minutes he would stop and look at his wife with a mixture of awe and regret. Awe at how brilliantly she'd handled an impossible situation, and regret that he'd failed to protect her from it in the first place. When he tried to apologize for the 3rd time, Lisa placed a gentle hand on his arm and shook her head. "You're not responsible for other people's choices," she said softly. "You handled it perfectly when you understood what was really happening." The twins had watched Margaret's departure from their bedroom window, confusion evident on their young faces. They'd experienced 4 days of upheaval followed by their grandmother's sudden exit, and now they needed their parents to help them make sense of it all. Lisa found them sitting on Maya's bed, huddled together like soldiers seeking comfort after a difficult mission. "Mama," Sofia asked quietly, "did we do something wrong? Is that why Grandmother Margaret left?" Lisa's heart clenched at the question. Children always blamed themselves when adults behaved badly, and she'd seen the same guilt in the eyes of Iraqi children whose homes had become battlefields through no fault of their own. "No, Moanwern," Lisa said, sitting between her daughters and pulling them close. "Sometimes grown-ups forget how to share and play nicely, just like kids do sometimes. Grandmother Margaret forgot that this is our home, not hers, and she needed to remember how to be a good guest." She kept the explanation simple but honest, the same way she'd learned to brief civilian populations about military operations. Enough truth to help them understand, not so much detail that it would frighten them. Maya, who was 2 minutes older than Sofia and took her big sister responsibilities seriously, asked the more difficult question. Will Daddy be sad that his mommy left? Lisa looked through the doorway at David, who was carefully rebuilding the spice cabinet organization that Margaret had dismantled. His movements were methodical, almost meditative, as if restoring order to the physical space would help him process the emotional chaos. Daddy loves his mommy, Lisa explained, but he loves us more, and sometimes when people we love make choices that hurt our family, we have to set boundaries to keep everyone safe. It was a lesson she'd learned in the military. Loving someone didn't mean accepting behavior that endangered the mission or the team. Over the following days, the story of what had happened spread through their neighborhood, and David's workplace with the viral intensity that only really good justice stories achieve. Frank Martinez, their next-door neighbor and a Vietnam veteran, stopped by with a case of beer and a knowing grin. Heard Margaret Thompson finally met her match, he said, raising his bottle in a toast to Lisa. Should have known better than to mess with a combat engineer. The wives at David's hospital, who'd always seen Lisa as the quiet military spouse who helped with their charity drives, suddenly viewed her with a new kind of respect. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency department chief, cornered David during his next shift. "Your wife just became a legend around here," she told him. "Half the staff wants to hire her as a consultant for dealing with difficult family members." But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after Margaret's departure, a package arrived addressed to Lisa with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Margaret's younger sister, Patricia, whom Lisa had met only once at David and Lisa's wedding. "Dear Lisa," the letter began, "I heard about what happened between you and Margaret, and I wanted you to know that some of us in the family have been waiting years for someone to stand up to her behavior. Margaret has been bulldozing over people since we were children, and everyone always just accommodated her because it was easier than fighting back. What you did took courage, and I'm grateful that David finally has someone in his corner who won't let him be manipulated." Patricia went on to share stories of Margaret's pattern of behavior, how she'd driven away David's previous girlfriends with similar tactics, how she'd made Patricia's own wedding planning miserable by insisting on controlling every detail, and how family gatherings had become exercises in managing Margaret's need to dominate every situation. "You didn't just defend your home," Patricia wrote. "You broke a cycle that's been going on for decades." The letter validated what Lisa had suspected during the confrontation, that Margaret's behavior wasn't personal or specific to her military background. It was a pattern of control and dominance that had nothing to do with Lisa's qualifications as a wife and mother, and everything to do with Margaret's inability to respect boundaries or share authority. David's relationship with his mother entered a new phase that could best be described as cautious diplomacy. Margaret called occasionally, their conversations brief and carefully neutral. She sent birthday cards to the twins but didn't offer to visit, and when David suggested family gatherings, she declined with vague excuses about being busy. The message was clear. She understood that her previous tactics were no longer acceptable, but she wasn't ready to acknowledge her mistakes or apologize for the damage she'd caused. Some of David's relatives criticized him for choosing his wife over his mother, but others, including Patricia and several cousins, quietly expressed relief that someone had finally drawn clear boundaries with Margaret. Family dynamics that had been strained for years began to improve as people realized they didn't have to tolerate manipulative behavior just because it came from a family member. Lisa's own extended family, scattered across California and Mexico, heard the story through the military spouse network and responded with a mixture of pride and amusement. Her mother called to say, "Mija, I taught you to cook with love and fight with honor. Sounds like you did both." Her former commanding officer, Colonel Janet Walsh, sent a text that simply read, "Outstanding tactical response. Recommend for commendation." 6 months later, Lisa received an invitation to speak at a military spouse support group about transitioning from military to civilian leadership. She almost declined, still thinking of herself as just a mom trying to protect her family, but David encouraged her to accept. "You've got skills that other people need to learn," he told her. "What you did wasn't just about defending our kitchen. It was about knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it." The presentation became an annual event, with Lisa sharing her experience as an example of how military training could be adapted to civilian challenges. She talked about strategic thinking, documentation, understanding legal rights and the importance of choosing your battles wisely. But most importantly, she emphasized that true strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about protecting what mattered most while maintaining your own integrity. Years later, when Maya and Sofia were teenagers dealing with their own challenges with difficult people, Lisa would remind them of the Margaret Thompson incident. "Sometimes people will test your boundaries to see if you'll defend them," she'd tell her daughter. "The key is knowing what's worth fighting for and having the skills to win when you do fight." The kitchen remained Lisa's sanctuary, but now it held a different kind of meaning. It wasn't just the heart of her home, it was proof that some territories are worth defending, and that underestimating a quiet person can be the biggest tactical mistake an opponent ever makes. 2 years after the kitchen confrontation that had become local legend, Lisa Rodriguez found herself sitting in the conference room of Riverside Community College, facing a panel of administrators who were offering her something she'd never expected: a position teaching conflict resolution and leadership skills to military spouses, transitioning to civilian career. The irony wasn't lost on her. The quiet woman who'd once been dismissed as just a military wife was now being recruited for her expertise in strategic thinking and boundary management. "Mrs. Rodriguez," said Dr. Angela Foster, the college's continuing education director, "your reputation in our community has grown considerably since the incident with your mother-in-law. We've had multiple requests from military families asking if we could offer training based on your approach to civilian conflict resolution." Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, still unused to being seen as an expert rather than just a mom doing her best to protect her family. The college had tracked down Lisa after her informal presentation to the military spouse group had generated requests for more comprehensive training. Word had spread through the military community about the combat engineer who'd used strategic documentation, legal research, and tactical communication to neutralize a family threat without losing her integrity or damaging relationships unnecessarily. Military spouses, who often struggled with feeling powerless in civilian situations, were hungry for practical skills that could help them advocate for themselves and their family. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach," Lisa admitted, though her mind was already analyzing the logistics of such a program with the same systematic approach she'd applied to everything else. "I'm not a trained educator or counselor." Dr. Foster smiled and slid a folder across the table. "Actually, that's exactly why you're perfect for this. You're not teaching theory, you're teaching real-world application of skills that most civilians never learn. Your military experience gives you credibility, but your success as a spouse and mother proves that these skills translate to family life." The folder contained letters from military spouses across Southern California who'd heard Lisa's story through the informal network that connected military families. Maria Santos from Camp Pendleton wrote about finally standing up to her manipulative sister-in-law after applying Lisa's documentation techniques. Jennifer Walsh from 29 Palms described how she'd used strategic communication to resolve a custody dispute with her ex-husband's mother. Sharon Kim from Edwards Air Force Base credited Lisa's example with giving her the confidence to advocate for her special needs son at school board meetings. "These women see you as proof that their military training has value in civilian situations," Dr. Foster explained. "You've shown them that being a military spouse doesn't mean being powerless. It means having skills that most civilians lack." Lisa read through the letters, recognizing herself in their stories of feeling dismissed, underestimated, and frustrated by their inability to make their voices heard in civilian settings. The program, which they decided to call Strategic Leadership for Military Families, launched 6 months later with Lisa as the primary instructor. The first class was small, 8 military spouses from various branches and deployment backgrounds, but the enthusiasm was infectious. Lisa structured the curriculum like a military training program, with clear objectives, practical exercises, and real-world application opportunities. "The first thing we need to understand," Lisa told her inaugural class, "is that civilian conflict operates differently than military conflict, but many of the same strategic principles apply." She used her whiteboard to diagram the Margaret Thompson incident, breaking down each phase of the confrontation and explaining the tactical decisions behind her responses. Documentation, legal research, strategic communication, and tactical patience. These aren't just military skills, they're life skills. The students were fascinated by Lisa's analytical approach to what they'd assumed was purely emotional conflict. Sandra Mitchell, a Navy spouse dealing with housing discrimination, raised her hand. "I've been getting angry and arguing with my landlord about the mold problem in our apartment. Based on what you're showing us, I've been fighting the wrong battle entirely." Lisa nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Emotional responses give your opponent ammunition. Professional documentation and legal knowledge give you leverage." Within a year, the program had expanded to 3 campuses and generated interest from civilian organizations dealing with workplace harassment and family conflict. Lisa found herself consulting with the hospital where David worked, helping them develop protocols for dealing with aggressive family members in emergency situations. The skills she'd learned in combat, situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and protective positioning, proved invaluable for medical staff dealing with highly emotional situations. The twins, now 10 years old, had become inadvertent beneficiaries of their mother's growing reputation. Maya came home from school one day with a story about standing up to a classroom bully who'd been picking on a smaller student. "I used your documentation method, Mama," she announced proudly. "I wrote down everything he did, when he did it, and who saw it happen. Then I gave the report to Miss Patterson, instead of just telling her he was being mean." Sofia, meanwhile, had developed into a natural mediator among her friend group, using techniques she'd absorbed from listening to her mother's phone calls with other military spouses. When her best friend Emma got into a fight with another girl over a perceived slight, Sofia helped them work through the conflict by establishing each person's actual concerns, rather than their emotional reactions. "It's like Mama says," Sofia explained to Dave. "You have to figure out what people really want before you can solve the problem." The program's success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Rebecca Martinez, a psychology professor at UC Riverside, approached Lisa about collaborating on research into the civilian applications of military conflict resolution training. "Your approach combines elements of negotiation theory, strategic communication, and psychological operations," Martinez explained, "but you're applying them to everyday family and social conflicts in ways that academic theory hasn't adequately addressed." Their research collaboration led to a published paper titled "Tactical Thinking in Civilian Contexts: Military Spouse Adaptation Strategies," which was presented at conferences on family psychology and conflict resolution. Lisa found herself quoted in articles about military family resilience and invited to speak at events she'd never imagined attending. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Margaret Thompson, who'd maintained her distant relationship with David and the family, sent a brief email 2 years after her departure. "Lisa," it read, "I saw an article about your teaching program in the newspaper. I wanted you to know that I've been attending therapy to work on my controlling behaviors. You were right to defend your family, and I was wrong to challenge your authority in your own home. I hope someday we can rebuild our relationship on better terms." The email sparked long conversations between Lisa and David about forgiveness, boundaries, and the possibility of redemption. They agreed to consider supervised visits with the twins if Margaret completed her therapy program and demonstrated sustained behavioral change. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was progress toward healing relationships that had been damaged by years of unhealthy patterns. Lisa's kitchen, which had been the battlefield for the original conflict, had evolved into something more significant, a symbol of the importance of defending what matters most, while maintaining the possibility of future peace. The twins did their homework at the island where Lisa had once stood her ground against Margaret's invasion, and family dinners were filled with conversations about strategy, fairness, and the difference between fighting and problem-solving. The woman who'd once been dismissed as just a military wife had become a bridge between two worlds, helping other military families translate their hard-earned skills into civilian success while proving that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud dominance. Lisa Rodriguez had defended more than just her kitchen. She'd defended the idea that everyone deserves respect in their own home, and that sometimes the best way to win a war is to be so thoroughly prepared that your opponent realizes they've already lost. 3 years after the kitchen confrontation that had redefined her life, Lisa Rodriguez received a phone call that would test everything she'd learned about forgiveness, strategic thinking, and the complex nature of family relationships. The caller was Patricia Thompson, Margaret's sister, and her voice carried an urgency that immediately put Lisa's military training on alert. "Lisa, I need your help," Patricia said without preamble. "Margaret is in trouble, and you're the only person I know who has the skills to handle what's happening to her." Lisa's first instinct was to decline. She'd built a peaceful life since Margaret's departure, and reopening that chapter seemed like inviting chaos back into her carefully ordered world. But Patricia's next words stopped her cold. "Someone is doing to Margaret exactly what she did to you, but this person is dangerous in ways that Margaret never was." The story Patricia unfolded was both ironic and disturbing. Margaret, now 65 and living alone in a retirement community in Palm Springs, had fallen under the influence of a man named Richard Blackwood, who'd positioned himself as a financial advisor and life coach for wealthy widows and divorcees. Richard had slowly but systematically taken control of Margaret's finances, her social relationships, and her living situation, using tactics that were disturbingly familiar to anyone who'd experienced Margaret's own manipulative behavior. "He's isolated her from the family," Patricia explained, her voice tight with worry, "convinced her that we're all trying to take advantage of her, that only he understands her true worth. He's moved into her condo, taken over her bank accounts, and now he's pressuring her to sign over power of attorney. Lisa, I think this man is dangerous, and Margaret doesn't see it because she's never been on the receiving end of manipulation before." Lisa found herself in the surreal position of being asked to rescue the woman who'd tried to destroy her family life. The irony was almost overwhelming. Margaret Thompson, who'd dismissed Lisa's military experience as irrelevant to domestic life, now needed those same strategic skills to escape a predator who'd turned her own tactics against her. But as Lisa listened to Patricia's description of Richard's methods, her training kicked in automatically. This wasn't about Margaret personally. This was about protecting a vulnerable person from a sophisticated threat. "Tell me everything you know about this Richard Blackwood," Lisa said, reaching for a notepad with the practiced efficiency of someone preparing for a mission briefing. Patricia's relief was audible as she began sharing details about the man who'd wormed his way into Margaret's life. Richard was 58, recently divorced, with a background in pharmaceutical sales that had given him skills in persuasion and relationship building. He'd met Margaret at a grief counseling group for people who'd lost spouses, even though his own divorce was voluntary. "He love-bombed her at first," Patricia continued, using terminology that Lisa recognized from her training in psychological operations. "Flowers, expensive dinners, constant attention." Margaret had never experienced anything like it. "You know how controlling she's always been in relationships. Having someone focus entirely on her was intoxicating." Lisa took notes, recognizing the classic pattern of predatory behavior that targeted lonely, financially stable older adults. The situation had escalated over the past 6 months. Richard had gradually moved his belongings into Margaret's condo, claiming his own place had termite damage. He'd convinced her to consolidate her finances for efficiency, gaining access to accounts worth nearly $500,000. Most concerning, he'd begun isolating Margaret from her few remaining friends and family members, by convincing her that they were jealous of her new happiness and trying to sabotage her relationship. "She won't listen to any of us," Patricia said desperately. When David tried to talk to her, Richard intercepted the call and told her that her own son was trying to steal her inheritance. She actually accused David of being jealous of her financial independence. "Lisa, I know you have every reason to hate Margaret, but you're the only person I know who's successfully stood up to manipulation tactics. Will you help us?" Lisa's decision surprised even herself. Despite everything Margaret had put her family through, the idea of an elderly woman being financially and emotionally exploited triggered every protective instinct Lisa had developed during her military service. This wasn't about Margaret personally, it was about principles of justice and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "I'll help," Lisa said, quietly. "But we do this my way, with proper planning and documentation. This isn't a family intervention. It's a tactical operation." The planning phase took 2 weeks and involved coordination with Patricia, David, who was initially skeptical but ultimately supportive, and surprisingly, a detective from the Palm Springs Police Department, who specialized in elder fraud. Detective Maria Santos had been building a case against Richard Blackwood for months, having identified him as part of a network targeting wealthy retirees across Southern California. "Mr. Blackwood is sophisticated," Detective Santos explained during their strategy meeting at the Riverside police station. "He's not technically breaking any laws as long as his victims give consent to his financial arrangement. But we've documented a pattern of behavior that suggests organized exploitation. If we can get evidence of coercion or fraud, we can build a criminal case." Lisa's role would be to conduct reconnaissance and gather evidence while posing as a potential victim herself. Her military background had given her skills in surveillance and information gathering that civilian law enforcement sometimes lacked, and her recent experience with Margaret meant she understood the specific psychological vulnerabilities that Richard was likely exploiting. The operation began with Lisa attending the same grief counseling group where Richard had originally targeted Margaret. Posing as a recently divorced military spouse with a substantial settlement, Lisa presented herself as exactly the kind of financially stable, emotionally vulnerable woman that Richard preferred. Her performance was flawless. Years of military briefings had taught her how to assume a role convincingly, and her genuine experience with loss and transition gave her story authentic emotional depth. Richard approached her after the third meeting, his tactics so predictable that Lisa felt like she was watching a training video on manipulation technique. The love bombing phase was exactly as Patricia had described: excessive attention, expensive gestures, and constant validation designed to overwhelm her emotional defenses. Lisa played the role of a grateful, slightly lonely woman who was flattered by his attention, all while carefully documenting every interaction and technique he used. "You're so different from other women," Richard told her over dinner at an expensive restaurant, his hand covering hers across the table. "Most people don't understand what you've been through, the sacrifices you've made, but I see your strength. You're independent." Lisa smiled and nodded while mentally cataloging his approach. He was targeting her military background specifically, trying to position himself as the one person who truly understood her unique experience. The breakthrough came during their fourth dinner date when Richard began probing about her financial situation with questions that seemed casual but were clearly designed to assess her net worth. Lisa fed him carefully crafted information about fictional investment accounts and property holdings, watching his interest intensify with each detail. By the end of the evening, he was already suggesting ways they could optimize her financial management through consolidation and professional investment strategies, but the most valuable intelligence came from an unexpected source. During a coffee meeting at Margaret's condo where Richard had insisted on playing host, Lisa noticed details that confirmed Detective Santos's suspicions about organized fraud. The condo contained expensive electronics and artwork that seemed inconsistent with Margaret's previously modest lifestyle, and Richard's casual mention of other clients suggested a broader operation than simple romance fraud. The evidence Lisa gathered over 6 weeks of careful surveillance provided Detective Santos with enough material to obtain warrants for Richard's financial records and communication device. The investigation revealed a network of similar relationships with at least 8 other women across the region, with total financial exploitation exceeding $2 million. Richard Blackwood wasn't just a con artist, he was the leader of an organized elder fraud ring that had been operating for over 3 years. The arrest came swiftly once law enforcement had sufficient evidence. Lisa was present, at Detective Santos's request, when they executed the warrant at Margaret's condo. Watching Richard's shock and indignation as he was handcuffed was satisfying, but seeing Margaret's confusion and devastation was heartbreaking. The woman who'd once seemed invincible in her certainty was now clearly a victim, disoriented and frightened by the collapse of what she'd believed was genuine love and security. In the aftermath of Richard's arrest,
Lisa found herself in the unexpected position of providing emotional support to the woman who'd once tried to destroy her family. Margaret's apology, when it finally came, was comprehensive and genuine in a way that her brief email years earlier had only hinted at. "I never understood what it felt like to be manipulated and controlled," Margaret admitted during one of their difficult conversations. "I thought I was strong enough to see through anyone's lies, but he used my own loneliness and pride against me. I'm beginning to understand what I put you and David through." The experience had transformed both women in unexpected ways. Lisa discovered that her capacity for forgiveness was larger than she'd realized, while Margaret began the difficult process of acknowledging the pain she'd caused others through her own controlling behavior. Their relationship would never be the simple, warm connection that might have existed in different circumstances, but it had evolved into something more complex and honest, a mutual recognition of each other's strength and humanity.
5 years after the kitchen confrontation that had started it all, Lisa Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the San Diego Convention Center, delivering the keynote address at the National Conference on Elder Protection and Family Security. The irony of her journey wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd once been dismissed as just a military wife was now recognized as a leading expert in strategic conflict resolution and financial exploitation prevention. The audience of social workers, law enforcement officers, military family advocates, and legal professionals listened intently as Lisa recounted the Margaret Thompson case, which had become a landmark example of how personal conflict resolution skills could translate into broader community protection efforts. But what made her presentation truly powerful wasn't just the tactical success of the operation, it was the complex human story of forgiveness, growth, and unexpected alliances that had emerged from it. "The most important lesson I learned," Lisa told the audience, "wasn't about defeating an opponent. It was about recognizing that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, and that protecting our communities sometimes requires us to help people who've hurt us." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photo of herself and Margaret working together at a victim advocacy training session, both women smiling genuinely despite their complicated history. The relationship between Lisa and Margaret had evolved into something neither woman could have predicted. After Richard Blackwood's conviction and sentencing to 8 years in federal prison, Margaret had thrown herself into understanding how she'd been victimized and, more importantly, how her own behavior had made her an ideal target for manipulation. The therapy she'd begun years earlier had taken on new urgency as she grappled with the dual realization that she'd been both perpetrator and victim of controlling behavior. "I spent my whole life thinking that being strong meant being in control," Margaret had told Lisa during one of their regular coffee meetings, which had become a monthly tradition. "Richard was able to manipulate me precisely because I'd never learned the difference between strength and dominance. You showed me that real strength is about protecting what matters, not controlling what doesn't belong to you." Their alliance had proven surprisingly effective in ways that neither woman had anticipated. Margaret's experience as both a manipulator and a victim gave her unique insights into the psychology of exploitation, while Lisa's strategic training provided the tactical framework for translating those insights into actionable protection strategies. Together, they developed a training program for families dealing with elder exploitation that combined psychological awareness with practical defense techniques. The program, which they'd named Strategic Family Protection, had been implemented across 12 states and credited with preventing an estimated $50 million in elder fraud over 3 years. Margaret's willingness to share her story publicly, despite the personal embarrassment involved, had become one of the program's most powerful tools. When potential victims heard her describe how someone had used her own controlling tendencies against her, they paid attention in ways that abstract warnings could never achieve. "The hardest part," Margaret would tell audiences, "wasn't admitting that I'd been fooled. It was admitting that I'd fooled myself into thinking that control was love, that criticism was care, and that dominance was protection. Richard was able to exploit me because I'd never learned healthy relationship boundaries. I was an easy target because I'd spent years practicing unhealthy patterns with my own family." David's relationship with his mother had undergone its own transformation during this period. The shared crisis of Richard's exploitation had forced both mother and son to confront decades of dysfunctional communication patterns, but it had also revealed the genuine love that had always existed beneath the manipulation and control. Their relationship was still careful, still bounded by clear limits that Lisa and David maintained, but it was honest in a way it had never been before. "I'm proud of my mom," David told Lisa one evening, as they watched Margaret give a television interview about elder fraud prevention. Not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to change. "It takes courage to admit you've been wrong for 60 years and then do the work to become better." Lisa squeezed his hand, remembering the angry, confused man who'd stood in their kitchen 5 years earlier, caught between his wife and his mother without understanding how he'd ended up in the middle of a war. The twins, now teenagers, had grown up watching their mother's career evolution with a mixture of pride and bemusement. Maya had developed an interest in criminal justice, inspired by her mother's work with law enforcement, while Sofia was drawn to psychology and the therapeutic aspects of helping families heal from trauma. Both girls had absorbed lessons about boundaries, respect, and strategic thinking that would serve them well in their own future relationships. "It's weird having a mom who's kind of famous for standing up to bullies," Maya told her friends, "but also really cool. Like, she taught me that you don't have to be mean to be strong, but you also don't have to be weak to be nice." Sofia had put it more simply, "Mom taught me that protecting people is more important than being popular, and that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to help your enemy become a better person." The professional recognition that had followed Lisa's work had opened doors she'd never imagined. She'd been invited to consult with the Department of Veterans Affairs on family reintegration programs, worked with the FBI's white-collar crime division on elder exploitation patterns, and co-authored 2 academic papers on the civilian applications of military strategic thinking. But perhaps most meaningfully, she'd been asked to serve on the board of the National Military Family Association, where her experiences bridging military and civilian conflict had become a model for other veteran families. The annual conference had become a touchstone for Lisa's professional development, but this year felt different. As she concluded her keynote address, she realized that her story had reached a natural completion point. She'd defended her family, built a career helping others, and even found a way to transform her most difficult relationship into something positive and productive. The journey from that morning in her kitchen to this moment on the national stage felt like the completion of a mission she'd never known she was undertaking. But the most significant moment of the conference came during the Q&A session, when a young military spouse in the audience stood up with a question that brought Lisa's journey full circle. "Miss Rodriguez," the woman said, her voice carrying the uncertainty that Lisa remembered from her own early days as a military wife, "I'm dealing with a situation similar to what you described with your mother-in-law, but it's my husband's entire family. They think I'm not good enough for him because I'm enlisted and he's an officer. How do I defend myself without destroying his relationships with people he loves?" Lisa looked out at the young woman, probably no more than 25, wearing her dress uniform with obvious pride, but asking her question with the vulnerability of someone who felt outnumbered and outgunned. She saw herself in that uniform, in that uncertainty, in that determination to protect her family while maintaining her integrity. The answer she gave wasn't just tactical advice, it was a passing of wisdom from one generation of military women to the next. "The first thing you need to understand," Lisa said, her voice carrying the authority of experience, "is that defending yourself isn't about proving your worth to people who've already decided not to see it. It's about establishing boundaries that protect your family and your relationship while giving others the opportunity to choose respect over conflict. You don't fight to win their approval, you fight to protect what matters most." As the conference ended and attendees approached her with their own stories and questions, Lisa realized that her kitchen confrontation with Margaret Thompson had been more than just a family conflict. It had been the beginning of a larger mission to help military families translate their hard-earned skills into civilian success. The woman who'd once been underestimated had become a bridge between worlds, proving that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud dominance, and that sometimes the best victory is helping your former enemy become your greatest ally. The kitchen where it all began still served as the heart of the Rodriguez home, but now it held a deeper meaning. It wasn't just the place where Lisa had defended her territory, it was the birthplace of a movement that had helped thousands of families protect what mattered most while building bridges instead of walls. 7 years after the kitchen confrontation that had changed everything, Lisa Rodriguez found herself sitting in the principal's office of Riverside High School, but this time she wasn't there as a concerned parent. She was there as an expert consultant. The irony wasn't lost on her as she looked across the desk at Principal Janet Morrison, who was explaining a bullying situation that had the entire school administration baffled. "We've tried everything traditional," Principal Morrison said, frustration evident in her voice. "Suspension, mediation, parent conferences, counseling. But this isn't typical teenage bullying. These kids are sophisticated in ways we've never seen before. They're using social media manipulation, financial pressure, and psychological tactics that feel almost professional." Lisa listened with the analytical focus that had become second nature, taking notes as the principal described a group of wealthy students who'd essentially created a protection racket within the school's social hierarchy. Led by a senior named Brandon Pierce, whose father was a prominent local businessman, the group had systematized the extraction of money, favors, and social compliance from their classmates through carefully orchestrated campaigns of intimidation and exclusion. "They're not physically violent," Principal Morrison continued, "which makes them harder to discipline under traditional policy. But they've created an atmosphere where kids are afraid to eat lunch, participate in activities, or even attend school events without paying what amounts to tribute to Brandon's group. Parents are starting to pull their children out of school." As the principal spoke, Lisa found herself thinking about her own daughters, now 16 and thriving at the same school. Maya and Sofia had grown up watching their mother navigate complex conflicts with strategic thinking and principled resistance, and both girls had developed reputations as natural leaders who stood up for underdogs. But Lisa also knew that teenage social dynamics could be more brutal and complicated than any military operation she'd ever planned. "What makes you think this situation requires non-traditional intervention?" Lisa asked, though she was already beginning to see the parallels between what Principal Morrison was describing and the sophisticated manipulation tactics she'd encountered in her elder protection work. The principal slid a thick folder across the desk, filled with printed screenshots, financial records, and detailed incident reports that looked more like intelligence dossiers than typical school disciplinary files. "Brandon Pierce is 18, legally an adult, and his father's law firm has made it clear that they'll challenge any disciplinary action through the courts," Principal Morrison explained. "But more importantly, we're seeing tactics that mirror adult financial crimes, money laundering through fake fundraisers, identity theft for social media harassment, and psychological manipulation techniques that suggest someone is coaching these kids. This isn't normal teenage meanness. This is organized exploitation." Lisa studied the documentation with growing concern. The patterns were indeed sophisticated, showing evidence of systematic planning, coordinated execution, and adaptation to countermeasures that suggested adult-level strategic thinking. Brandon's group had created what amounted to a criminal enterprise within the high school, complete with hierarchical organization, specialized roles, and financial incentives that kept lower-level participants loyal through a combination of rewards and threats. "Have you involved law enforcement?" Lisa asked, noting several activities that appeared to cross the line from bullying into actual criminal behavior. Principal Morrison nodded grimly. "Detective Santos from your elder fraud case is actually the one who suggested we contact you. She thinks this might be connected to broader patterns of youth exploitation that she's been tracking across the region." The mention of Detective Santos immediately sharpened Lisa's focus. Maria Santos had become a close professional colleague over the years, and her instincts about organized criminal activity were rarely wrong. If she saw connections between high school bullying and broader exploitation patterns, then this situation was likely more serious than anyone realized. "I'll need to observe the environment before making any recommendations," Lisa told Principal Morrison. "But I want to be clear about my role here. I'm not a licensed counselor or educator, and I'm definitely not interested in going undercover in a high school." The principal laughed, the first genuine moment of humor in their conversation. "Actually, we have a better idea. Maya Rodriguez is one of our most respected student leaders, and she's been quietly documenting some of these incidents for weeks. We think she inherited more than just her mother's strategic thinking." The revelation that her own daughter was already involved in investigating the situation filled Lisa with a complex mixture of pride and concern. Maya had indeed inherited her mother's analytical mind and protective instincts, but high school social warfare could be devastating for teenagers in ways that adult conflict rarely matched. Lisa made a mental note to have a serious conversation with Maya about the risks of amateur intelligence gathering. Sofia has been working with our peer counseling program to support some of the victims. Principal Morrison continued. Both your daughters have been natural leaders in responding to this situation, but they need adult guidance to avoid becoming targets themselves. Brandon's group has already identified them as potential threats. The meeting concluded with Lisa agreeing to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the situation, working with both the school administration and Detective Santos to determine whether criminal charges were warranted. But her first priority was protecting her own daughters, who'd apparently inherited not just her strategic thinking, but also her instinct to defend others regardless of personal risk. That evening, Lisa sat down with Maya and Sofia in their kitchen, the same space where she'd once faced down their grandmother's manipulation, for one of the most important conversations of their lives. Both girls had grown into confident, thoughtful young women who'd learned from watching their mother navigate complex conflicts, but they were still teenagers dealing with the intense social pressures of high school. "Mom, we know what you're thinking," Maya said before Lisa could begin her prepared speech about the dangers of amateur investigation. "But we couldn't just watch Brandon's group destroy people and do nothing. You taught us that protecting others is more important than protecting ourselves." Sofia nodded in agreement. "Plus, we're not doing anything dangerous. We're just documenting what we see and supporting the victims. It's exactly what you did with grandmother Margaret." Lisa felt her heart swell with pride even as her protective instincts screamed warnings about the risks her daughters were taking. They had indeed absorbed the lessons she'd tried to teach them about principled resistance and strategic thinking, but they were applying those lessons in an environment that could be far more cruel and unpredictable than adult conflict. "I understand why you're doing this," Lisa said carefully, "and I'm proud that you want to help people. But high school social dynamics are different from adult conflict. Teenagers can be more vicious than adults because they haven't learned to consider long-term consequences. I need you to promise me that you'll coordinate with me before taking any direct action." Maya and Sofia exchanged a look that told Lisa they'd already discussed this possibility. "We were hoping you'd say that," Sofia said with a slight smile, "because we think Brandon's group is about to make a big mistake, and we could use some professional guidance on how to respond." Maya nodded and pulled out her phone, showing Lisa a series of screenshots that made her blood run cold. "They're planning something for the homecoming dance," Maya explained. "Something they're calling Operation Clean Sweep, that's supposed to permanently establish the proper social order at school." "Mom, the language they're using sounds like military planning document. Someone is definitely coaching them." As Lisa studied her daughter's evidence, she realized that the situation was more serious than even Principal Morrison had understood. This wasn't just sophisticated bullying, it was a pilot program for something larger and more dangerous. The tactics being tested on high school students could easily be scaled up to adult communities, workplaces, or online environments. The kitchen where Lisa had once defended her family against invasion was about to become the planning center for a new kind of operation, one that would require all her skills as a strategist, a mother and a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. But this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. She'd be working alongside the next generation of principled warriors she'd helped create. The war for Riverside High School was about to begin, and the Pierce family had no idea they were about to face the combined tactical expertise of a decorated combat engineer and her daughters, who'd learned from watching their mother that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for territory or resources, but for the simple principle that everyone deserves to feel safe in their own community. The Rodriguez kitchen had been transformed into something resembling a military command center, with laptops, printed screenshots, organizational charts, and surveillance timelines covering every available surface. Lisa stood before a whiteboard she'd mounted on the wall, mapping out the social hierarchy at Riverside High School with the same methodical precision she'd once used to analyze enemy positions in Iraq. Maya and Sofia sat at the kitchen island, their homework pushed aside in favor of intelligence reports that read like professional reconnaissance documents. "This is more sophisticated than anything I encountered in my fraud prevention work," Lisa admitted, studying the evidence her daughters had compiled over the past month.
Brandon Pierce isn't just a high school bully who got carried away. Someone with professional training in psychological operations is coaching this entire organization. She pointed to a series of communications that Maya had intercepted through her role as student council treasurer, where she had legitimate access to inter-club financial records. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation that went far beyond typical teenage social cruelty. Brandon's group had created multiple revenue streams within the school environment: protection fees disguised as voluntary contributions to fake charity, monopolization of social events through intimidation and exclusion, and what amounted to loan sharking operations, where students borrowed money for basic social participation and then found themselves trapped in cycles of increasing debt and obligation. "Look at this organizational chart," Sofia said, pointing to a diagram she'd reconstructed from observing group interactions during lunch periods and after-school activities. Brandon is the visible leader, but there's clearly someone above him making strategic decisions. The kids in his inner circle refer to getting guidance from upstairs when they're planning new operations. Detective Santos had arrived an hour earlier, bringing with her a federal task force agent named Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in organized crime targeting minors. Agent Walsh studied the girls' documentation with growing concern, occasionally asking questions that revealed she'd been tracking similar patterns in schools across 3 states. "What we're seeing here fits a larger pattern that the Bureau has been investigating for 18 months, Agent Walsh explained. Someone is using high schools as testing grounds for social manipulation techniques that can later be applied to adult community. The psychological profiles they're developing, the coercion methods they're perfecting. This isn't about controlling teenagers, it's about developing a playbook for broader social control." The revelation that Maya and Sofia had unknowingly been documenting a federal investigation sent a chill through the room. Lisa's protective instincts immediately shifted into high gear as she realized her daughters had been gathering intelligence on what was potentially a national security threat. "How much danger are my girls?" she asked directly, her voice carrying the no-nonsense authority that had once commanded respect from combat-hardened soldiers. Agent Walsh's expression was serious but reassuring. "Right now they're probably safer than most students because they're documenting everything and working with us. The real danger would come from confronting this organization directly without backup. But their intelligence gathering has been invaluable. They've identified patterns and connections that our adult investigators missed, because we don't have natural access to the social environment." Maya leaned forward with the intensity that Lisa recognized as her own analytical focus. "There's something else. We think we know who the adult handler is." She pulled up a photo on her laptop showing a man in his 40s talking to Brandon Pierce outside the school library. "This is Marcus Webb, our new guidance counselor. He started working here right before the exploitation patterns began, and several students have mentioned being called to his office for special counseling sessions that don't appear in any official records." The identification of Webb as a potential suspect transformed the investigation from a school bullying issue into something far more serious. Agent Walsh immediately began coordinating background checks and surveillance protocols, while Detective Santos started mapping Webb's connections to similar cases in other districts. Lisa found herself once again in the familiar role of tactical coordinator, but this time she was protecting not just her own family but an entire community of vulnerable teenagers. "We need to be extremely careful about how we proceed," Lisa told the group, her military training kicking in as she assessed threats and opportunities. "If Dr. Webb is indeed the handler for this operation, then he has professional training in psychology and manipulation. He'll be watching for signs that his network is being investigated, and he'll have contingency plans for protecting himself and eliminating evidence." The planning session that followed felt like the mission briefings Lisa remembered from her combat deployments, with roles assigned based on capabilities and careful coordination to avoid detection. Maya would continue her legitimate student council activities while documenting financial irregularities. Sofia would maintain her peer counseling work while gathering testimonies from victims. Detective Santos would conduct official background investigations on Webb and his associates. Agent Walsh would coordinate with federal resources to map connections to similar operations in other locations. Lisa's role would be the most delicate, She would approach Dr. Webb directly, posing as a concerned parent seeking guidance about her daughter's concerning behavior of standing up to bullies. The cover story would allow her to assess Webb's methods firsthand, while potentially gathering evidence of his involvement in coaching the exploitation network. "This is exactly like the undercover work you did with Richard Blackwood," David observed when Lisa briefed him on the plan later that evening. "Except this time you're not just protecting Margaret, you're protecting hundreds of kids." David's support had been unwavering throughout Lisa's evolution from military spouse to community protector, but she could see the concern in his eyes as he realized the scope of what she was taking on. "The difference is that this time I have backup," Lisa replied, gesturing toward the command center their kitchen had become. "And I have 2 daughters who've inherited more than just my strategic thinking. They've inherited my sense of responsibility for protecting others." She looked at Maya and Sofia, who were still poring over evidence and coordinating with their classmates who'd agreed to serve as additional intelligence sources. The investigation had revealed something that neither the school administration nor law enforcement had fully grasped. The exploitation at Riverside High School wasn't an isolated incident or even a regional problem. It was part of a systematic effort to develop and test social control techniques that could be deployed against any community. The teenagers who were currently victims were also unwitting test subjects in a larger experiment in psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. But what the people behind this operation hadn't anticipated was encountering a family that had spent years developing expertise in exactly the kind of strategic thinking and principled resistance needed to counter their method. The kitchen where Lisa had once defended her family against a manipulative mother-in-law was now the headquarters for an operation that could potentially protect thousands of young people across the country. As Lisa prepared for her meeting with Webb, she reflected on how far she'd come from that morning 8 years ago when Margaret Thompson had tried to claim ownership of her kitchen. That confrontation had taught her that some battles are worth fighting, that strategic thinking could overcome brute force intimidation, and that protecting what mattered most sometimes required risking everything. Now she was about to apply those same lessons on a scale she'd never imagined, fighting not just for her own family but for an entire generation of young people who deserved to feel safe in their own school. The war against organized exploitation was entering a new phase, and Lisa Rodriguez was ready to show Dr. Marcus Webb and his network that they'd made the fatal mistake of operating in a community protected by someone who'd learned to think 10 moves ahead.
Lisa Rodriguez walked through the halls of Riverside High School with the controlled confidence of someone conducting a reconnaissance mission in hostile territory. The wire taped to her chest was barely detectable beneath her conservative blouse, and the micro-camera disguised as a button on her blazer was positioned to capture everything Dr. Marcus Webb might reveal during their scheduled meeting. After years of confronting manipulators and con artists, Lisa knew that the key to success was appearing to be exactly what her target expected while gathering the evidence needed to destroy them. Dr. Webb's office was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as therapeutic space. The furniture was arranged to make visitors feel simultaneously comfortable and vulnerable, with the counselor's chair positioned to maximize his authority while seemingly casual diplomas and certifications covered the walls in a display designed to establish credibility. Lisa's military training allowed her to catalog every detail: the recording equipment hidden behind books, the positioning of cameras that weren't quite concealed, and most importantly, the organizational charts and behavioral modification materials that Webb had been careless enough to leave partially visible. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Webb said with the practiced warmth of someone who'd perfected the art of gaining trust quickly, "thank you for coming in. I understand you're concerned about Maya and Sofia's recent behavior. It's always challenging when good students start acting out." His tone carried just the right mixture of professional concern and implied criticism, designed to make Lisa feel defensive about her daughters, while positioning him as the expert who could solve their problems. "I'm worried about their increasing defiance," Lisa replied, playing the role of an overwhelmed mother with Oscar-worthy performance. "They've been questioning authority, challenging other students' behavior, and generally making themselves unpopular with their peers. I don't understand what's gotten into them." She deliberately chose language that would appeal to Webb's apparent preference for compliant, easily controlled students, while painting her daughters as problems that needed his specific kind of intervention. Webb's eyes lit up with predatory interest as Lisa described her daughter's principled resistance to the exploitation they'd witnessed. "That's exactly the kind of disruptive behavior we've been seeing more of lately," he said, leaning forward with fake concern. "Some students seem to think they can challenge the natural social order without consequences. It's important that we address these tendencies before they become more serious problems." The phrase natural social order sent chills down Lisa's spine, confirming her suspicions that Webb's philosophy went far beyond normal educational guidance. She watched him pull out files on Maya and Sofia, noting how thick they were despite the girls having no disciplinary history. The documentation level suggested surveillance and behavioral analysis that went far beyond any legitimate counseling purpose. "I've been working with several students to help them understand the importance of fitting in and respecting established hierarchies," Webb continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a practice speech. "Your daughter's disruptive influence has been noted by other students, and I'm concerned about the negative impact they're having on school climate. Perhaps we could discuss some strategies for helping them become more cooperative." Lisa felt her jaw tighten at the veiled threat in Webb's words, but she maintained her performance of concerned confusion. "What kind of strategies are you thinking of?" "I just want my girls to be safe and successful at school." She deliberately emphasized her supposed helplessness, knowing that predators like Webb were drawn to victims who appeared vulnerable and isolated. Webb's response revealed the full scope of his operation. "We have several programs designed to help students understand social expectations," he explained, producing brochures for what appeared to be legitimate counseling services, but with language that Lisa recognized as textbook manipulation technique. Group therapy sessions where students learn to appreciate different perspectives, leadership training that teaches proper respect for authority, and peer counseling programs that help problematic students see how their behavior affects others. As Webb described these programs, Lisa realized she was listening to a systematic blueprint for breaking down independent thinking and replacing it with compliance to the exploitation network. The group therapy was clearly designed to isolate resistant students and subject them to peer pressure. The leadership training was indoctrination in accepting hierarchical control. The peer counseling was recruitment into the victim-perpetrator cycle that kept the system running. "Of course," Webb added with calculated casualness, "students who participate in these programs often find that their social standing improves dramatically. They make new friends, gain access to exclusive opportunities, and develop the kind of mature perspective that colleges and employers value. On the other hand, students who resist these interventions sometimes find high school becomes quite challenging for them." The threat was clear and unambiguous. Lisa was being offered a choice: allow her daughters to be processed through Webb's compliance programs, or watch them become targets for systematic harassment and exclusion. It was the same choice hundreds of other parents had faced, and Lisa could see how most would choose to sacrifice their children's independence rather than expose them to social warfare. But Marcus Webb had made the same mistake that Margaret Thompson and Richard Blackwood had made before him. He'd underestimated his opponent. While he'd been delivering his practiced manipulation routine, Lisa had been gathering evidence that would destroy his entire operation. The recording devices hidden in his office had captured not just his threats against her daughters, but also detailed admissions of systematic student exploitation that constituted multiple felonies. "Webb," Lisa said, her voice shifting from confused mother to professional authority with surgical precision, "I appreciate you being so thorough in explaining your program. It's helpful to understand exactly how you've been exploiting vulnerable teenagers for what appears to be a coordinated criminal enterprise." She reached into her purse and produced her phone, showing the active recording app that had been documenting their entire conversation. Webb's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: confusion, realization, fear, and finally rage as he understood that his carefully constructed cover had been completely penetrated. "You can't record me without consent," he stammered, reaching for his desk phone with hands that were suddenly shaking. "This is entrapment, harassment, violation of privacy." "Actually," Lisa interrupted calmly, "California is a two-party consent state for private conversations, but school employees discussing student welfare have no expectation of privacy when speaking with parents. More importantly, federal law enforcement has been recording this conversation through multiple channels, as part of an ongoing investigation into organized exploitation of minors. "Dr. Webb, you're under arrest." The words had barely left Lisa's mouth when Agent Walsh and Detective Santos entered the office with a team of federal marshals, having monitored the entire conversation from the school administration building. Webb's transformation from confident manipulator to panicked criminal was swift and complete, as handcuffs replaced his authoritative demeanor. As they led Webb away, Agent Walsh turned to Lisa with professional admiration. "Outstanding work, Mrs. Rodriguez. His admissions just gave us everything we need to roll up the entire network. We're executing simultaneous arrests in 12 schools across 4 states, based on the intelligence your family provided." Lisa watched through the office window as students in the hallway stopped to stare at the unprecedented sight of their guidance counselor being arrested. Among the crowd, she spotted Maya and Sofia, both girls standing with groups of friends who'd been secretly documenting the exploitation network's activity. The relief and pride on her daughters' faces reminded Lisa of the moment she'd first stood up to Margaret Thompson in her kitchen. The satisfaction of protecting what mattered most through strategic thinking and principled courage. The war against organized student exploitation was far from over, but the battle for Riverside High School had been decisively won. Marcus Webb had learned too late that targeting a community protected by a decorated combat engineer and her strategically trained daughters was a tactical error that would cost him his freedom and destroy his entire operation. The kitchen where it all began had produced not just one defender, but a family of protectors who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for territory or resources, but for the simple principle that everyone deserves to feel safe in their own community. 10 years after the kitchen confrontation that had started it all, Lisa Rodriguez stood before the largest audience of her career at the Pentagon's annual Defense Community Leadership Conference. The auditorium was filled with military families, senior officers, defense contractors, and policymakers who'd come to hear about the Rodriguez method, a comprehensive approach to civilian conflict resolution that had been adopted by military family services worldwide. But as Lisa looked out at the sea of uniforms and formal attire, her thoughts drifted to the simple kitchen where it all began. The decades since Margaret Thompson's initial invasion had transformed not just Lisa's life, but the lives of thousands of military families who'd learned to translate their hard-earned skills into civilian success. The strategic family protection program she'd developed with Margaret had been implemented across all 50 states, preventing an estimated $200 million in elder fraud and family exploitation. The youth protection protocols developed during the Riverside High School investigation had been adopted by school districts nationwide, protecting countless teenagers from organized exploitation networks. "The most important lesson I've learned," Lisa told the Pentagon audience, "is that the skills we develop in military service don't become obsolete when we transition to civilian life. They become more important than ever, because our communities need protectors who understand strategic thinking, principled resistance, and the difference between fighting and problem solving." She clicked to her next slide, which showed a photo of her kitchen island, surrounded by documents and laptops during the Webb investigation. Sometimes the most important command centers aren't in military facilities, they're in our homes, where we plan operations to protect what matters most. The presentation covered the full scope of what had become known as the Rodriguez method: systematic documentation of threats, strategic communication with authorities, tactical patience in gathering evidence, and coordinated response with both official and unofficial allies. But what made Lisa's approach unique wasn't just its military precision, it was its emphasis on transformation rather than destruction, turning former enemies into allies whenever possible while building communities that could protect themselves. Maya and Sofia, now 26 and successful in their own careers, sat in the front row with David and Margaret, who'd become an unlikely but effective advocate for family conflict resolution. Margaret's transformation from manipulative mother-in-law to respected elder protection specialist had become one of the most powerful examples of redemption and growth in the program's history. Her willingness to publicly acknowledge her past behavior and work to prevent others from making similar mistakes had saved hundreds of families from the kind of dysfunction that had once threatened to destroy the Rodriguez household. "Ms. Rodriguez," asked General Patricia Williams during the Q&A session, "your method emphasizes building bridges rather than burning them. How do you determine when someone can be reformed versus when they need to be permanently neutralized as a threat? It was the question Lisa heard most often, and it went to the heart of what made her approach different from purely punitive responses to manipulation and abuse. The key, Lisa replied, is distinguishing between people who are acting from pain or ignorance versus those who are acting from malice or greed. Margaret Thompson was controlling and manipulative because she'd never learned healthy relationship skills, not because she wanted to destroy my family. Richard Blackwood was exploiting elderly women because he was a predator who chose victims deliberately. Webb was systematically abusing children as part of an organized criminal enterprise. Each situation required a different response: education and boundaries for Margaret, legal prosecution for Richard and Webb. The distinction had become central to the Rodriguez method's success. Rather than treating all difficult people as irredeemable enemies, the approach provided frameworks for assessment, intervention, and either rehabilitation or neutralization, depending on the threat level and underlying motivation. Military families, who often dealt with high-stress situations and complex interpersonal dynamics, had found these tools invaluable for navigating civilian relationships and community conflict. After the presentation, Lisa was approached by Colonel Sarah Martinez, director of the Defense Department's Family Readiness Initiative. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we'd like to discuss expanding your program into active-duty military community. We're seeing increased incidents of exploitation targeting military spouses during deployments, and traditional security briefings aren't adequately preparing families for the sophisticated social manipulation techniques being used against them." The proposal represented another evolution in Lisa's journey from kitchen defender to national security asset. Military families were particularly vulnerable to exploitation because of their frequent relocations, extended separations, and access to sensitive information through their service members. Predators had begun specifically targeting military communities with increasingly sophisticated schemes designed to exploit the unique vulnerabilities created by military life. "I'd be honored to contribute to that effort," Lisa replied, "but I want to ensure that any program we develop maintains the emphasis on empowerment rather than fear. Military families are already under enough stress without being made paranoid about every interaction. The goal should be to give them tools for confident engagement with their communities, not reasons to isolate themselves." The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Agent Jennifer Walsh, now promoted to Deputy Director of the FBI's Organized Crime Division, approached with a smile that mixed professional respect with personal warmth. "Lisa, I wanted to personally thank you for the intelligence your family provided during the Webb investigation. That case led to the dismantling of exploitation networks in 47 schools and the prevention of what we estimate would have been systematic victimization of over 10,000 students." The numbers were staggering, but what impressed Lisa most was the ripple effect that had extended far beyond the immediate victims. Students who'd learned to recognize and resist manipulation in high school were proving more resilient to exploitation attempts in college and early career. Teachers who'd been trained in the warning signs were identifying and stopping similar networks before they could fully establish themselves. Parents who'd learned strategic documentation and communication techniques were becoming community advocates for children beyond their own family. "The most remarkable thing," Agent Walsh continued, "is how your approach has influenced our training programs for federal agents. The emphasis on strategic patience, comprehensive documentation, and building alliances, rather than just gathering evidence, has improved our success rates across multiple crime categories. You've essentially created a new paradigm for civilian law enforcement cooperation." As the evening wound down and the formal presentations concluded, Lisa found herself surrounded by military spouses who wanted to share their own stories of applying strategic thinking to civilian challenges. A Navy wife described how she'd used documentation techniques to stop a predatory landlord from exploiting military families. An Army spouse explained how she'd built a coalition to prevent a fraudulent charity from targeting her base community. An Air Force husband told how he'd applied tactical communication skills to resolve a custody dispute that had been manipulated by his ex-wife's family. Each story reinforced what Lisa had learned over the past decade. Military families possessed skills and perspectives that could benefit entire communities,
but they needed frameworks for applying those abilities to civilian situations. The Rodriguez method had provided those frameworks, but more importantly, it had given military families permission to see their service experience as an asset rather than something to be left behind when they transitioned to civilian life. As Lisa drove home from the Pentagon, her mind was already working on the next challenge, developing age-appropriate versions of strategic thinking and principled resistance for military children, who often faced unique social pressures related to their parents' service. Maya and Sofia had thrived partly because they'd grown up watching their mother navigate complex conflicts with integrity and intelligence, but not all military children had access to such modeling. The kitchen where it all began was still the heart of the Rodriguez home, but now it served as more than just a family gathering place. It had become a symbol of the principle that everyone deserves to feel safe in their own space, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not through force or dominance, but through strategic thinking, principled courage, and the wisdom to know when former enemies can become future allies. 10 years ago, Margaret Thompson had declared, "This kitchen is mine now," and learned that some territories are worth defending. Now thousands of families across the nation were applying those same lessons to protect their own communities, proving that the quiet strength of one military spouse could create ripples that changed the world. 15 years after Margaret Thompson had walked into her kitchen and declared, "This is mine now," Lisa Rodriguez stood in that same space, watching her daughter Maya prepare breakfast for her own family. Maya's 3-year-old son Carlos sat at the kitchen island, the same island where Lisa had once faced down manipulation and intimidation, carefully arranging his toy soldiers in defensive formations, while his mother explained the difference between protecting and attacking. "Abuela Lisa," Carlos said, using the Spanish term for grandmother that Lisa had taught him, "Mama says you're a real soldier who protects people. Can you teach me to be a protector too?" Lisa's heart swelled as she looked at her grandson, understanding that the values she'd fought to defend in this very kitchen were now being passed to a third generation. The kitchen itself had become something of a shrine, though Lisa resisted calling it. The walls were covered with photos spanning 2 decades, Lisa in her military uniform standing beside bridges she'd built under fire, Margaret receiving an award for elder protection advocacy, Maya and Sofia at their college graduation, Agent Walsh presenting Lisa with a civilian service commendation, and most recently, the entire Rodriguez family at the White House, when Lisa had been honored as a champion of change for military family advocacy. But the most meaningful photo was the simplest one, Lisa and Margaret standing together in this same kitchen, both women smiling genuinely as they prepared a meal for the family gathering that had become an annual tradition. It represented something Lisa had never imagined possible during those dark days when Margaret's invasion had threatened everything she held dear, the transformation of an enemy into an ally, conflict into collaboration, and pain into purpose. Sofia entered through the back door, carrying her own toddler daughter Isabella, who immediately ran to Lisa with the boundless energy of a 2-year-old. "Bisabuela," Isabella squealed, using the term for great-grandmother that acknowledged Margaret's role in the family. Despite everything that had happened, Margaret had earned her place as a beloved family member through years of consistent effort to make amends and contribute positively to their lives. "Today's the big day," Sofia announced, referring to the ceremony at Riverside High School where they would dedicate the new Student Protection Center that had been built with funding secured through the successful prosecution of Dr. Webb's exploitation network. The center would serve as a model for schools nationwide, providing resources for students facing manipulation, exploitation, or abuse while training them in the strategic thinking and principled resistance that had become hallmarks of the Rodriguez method. David appeared from the garage, now graying at the temples but still carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone whose family had taught him that love meant standing up for what's right. "The news crews are already setting up at the school," he reported. "They want to interview the family that started it all." Lisa shook her head with amusement. Even after all these years and all the recognition, she still thought of herself as simply a mom who'd refused to let anyone disrespect her family. Margaret arrived exactly on time, as she had every Sunday for the past 5 years, since their reconciliation had deepened into genuine mutual respect. At 72, she moved more slowly than before, but her mind remained sharp and her commitment to helping other families avoid the mistakes she'd made had never wavered. "Good morning, everyone," she said, accepting hugs from her great-grandchildren with the warmth of someone who'd learned that love was about giving, not taking. "Margaret," Lisa said, using the first name that had once felt so formal but now represented the equality and respect that defined their relationship. "Are you ready for your speech today?" Margaret would be addressing the dedication ceremony as someone who'd experienced both sides of family conflict, the perpetrator who'd caused pain and the advocate who'd worked to heal it. "I've been ready for this speech for 15 years, Margaret replied with a smile that mixed determination with humility. "Some lessons are worth repeating until everyone understands." She pulled out note cards covered with her precise handwriting, reviewing points that Lisa knew would emphasize accountability, redemption, and the possibility of change at any age. As the family prepared to leave for the ceremony, Lisa found herself alone in the kitchen for a quiet moment of reflection. This space had been her battlefield, her command center, her safe haven, and ultimately her launching pad for a mission she'd never planned but had been uniquely qualified to execute. The granite countertops still bore the faint marks from that first confrontation with Margaret, when Lisa had gripped the edge to maintain her composure while asserting her authority. But those marks now represented something different, not scars from conflict, but evidence of growth through challenge. Every difficult conversation, every strategic document, every moment of standing firm against intimidation, had led to this, a family that understood the difference between strength and dominance, a community that protected its most vulnerable members, and a legacy that would continue long after Lisa was gone. The dedication ceremony at Riverside High School drew crowds that extended far beyond the local community. Military families from across the region attended to show support for the woman who'd given them tools to protect themselves in civilian settings. Former students who'd been saved from exploitation networks spoke about the impact of learning strategic thinking and principled resistance during their teenage years. Law enforcement officials credited the Rodriguez method with transforming their approach to community protection. But the most powerful moment came when a young teacher named Jessica Chen approached Lisa after the ceremony. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I was one of Dr. Webb's victims 15 years ago. I was too scared to speak up then, but watching your daughters stand up to bullies gave me the courage to become a teacher who protects other kids. I wanted you to know that your family saved more than just your own community. You saved people you'll never even meet." Lisa felt tears she'd been holding back for years finally flow freely as she realized the full scope of what had grown from that first moment of standing firm in her kitchen. It hadn't been about defeating Margaret Thompson, or exposing Richard Blackwood, or stopping Dr. Webb, though all of those victories had mattered. It had been about establishing a principle that would ripple outward through generations. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own space, and sometimes ordinary people must do extraordinary things to protect what matters most. As the Rodriguez family drove home that evening, 3 generations packed into 2 cars, Lisa reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd entered military service to serve her country, never imagining that her greatest battles would be fought in civilian kitchens and high school hallways. She'd defended her family's peace, never knowing that those defensive actions would become offensive strategies that protected entire communities. "Abuela Lisa," Carlos said from his car seat as they pulled into their driveway, "when I grow up, I want to be a protector like you." Lisa turned to look at her grandson, seeing in his young eyes the same determination she'd felt that morning 15 years ago when she'd decided that some territories were worth defending. "Micho," she said gently, using the Spanish term of endearment her own grandmother had used, "you already are a protector. Every time you stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, every time you tell the truth when it's hard, every time you choose to help instead of hurt, you're protecting what matters most." The kitchen where it all began welcomed them home with the warmth of a space that had been defended, transformed, and ultimately sanctified by the love and courage of the family who'd refused to let anyone diminish their dignity or threaten their peace. The morning sun that had witnessed Margaret's invasion now illuminated a legacy that would continue through Carlos and Isabella and all the children they would someday teach. that real strength comes not from taking what doesn't belong to you, but from protecting what does. Lisa Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for territory or resources, but for principles that define who we are and what we stand for. She'd discovered that yesterday's enemy could become today's ally, that defensive actions could become transformative movements, and that a single moment of choosing courage over compliance could change not just one family but thousands of families across the nation. The quiet military spouse who'd been dismissed as just David's wife had become a guardian of communities, a teacher of strategic thinking, a bridge between military and civilian worlds, and most important, a mother and grandmother who'd shown her family that love means standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. In the end, Margaret Thompson had been right about one thing: the kitchen had indeed belonged to someone who knew how to use it properly. She'd just been wrong about who that someone was. The kitchen belonged to Lisa Rodriguez, not because of legal documents or family hierarchy, but because she'd been willing to defend it when it mattered most. And now, 15 years later, it belonged to everyone who understood that some spaces are sacred, some values are worth fighting for, and some victories echo through generations, creating a world where families can feel safe in their own homes, and communities can protect their most vulnerable members. The Rodriguez kitchen had become more than a room. It had become a symbol of the principle that ordinary people, armed with strategic thinking and principled courage, can defeat any opponent who underestimates the power of someone fighting to protect what they love most. The war that began with "This kitchen is mine now" had ended with a truth that would resonate for generations: home belongs to those brave enough to defend it.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.